centers on a lot of really redeeming qualities. There's some parts of the show that are, of course, not most appropriate, but one of the major themes is this theme of choosing to care about those who offend you beyond the offense that they created. And it's what you see over and over and over. And as you just saw, Ted Lasso, as he is choosing to live this kind of unoffended life, it starts inspiring people around him to show the same kind of willingness to look past offenses. And so tonight, we start this series on being unoffendable. And it's because this show captivated huge audiences because of just that theme. And as Christians, we have someone who, much like how Ted showed compassion to those who had offended him, we have a God who's done that with us. And what the Bible portrays us and how we're supposed to respond to offenses is not a culture or a group of people who get outraged. It's supposed to be a group of people who go around and choose to overlook offenses just like how his assistant coach did. That because of the love we have been shown, because of the mercy we have been shown, when someone offends us, we don't let that offense define who they are to us. Instead, we see the person behind it. We see the person beyond the offense and recognize that the right response to that may not be outrage or being offended, even though that's the easiest way to respond. And so, tonight I'm just going to kind of give an overview of how Scripture talks about offense. There's a Proverb 19:1 or 11. A person's insight gives him patience, and his virtue is to overlook an offense. That word there in the Hebrew, pesha, it's not just someone doing something wrong against you. It's the betrayal of a close friendship or relationship. It's a word that's used to talk about Jacob when he's freeing from Laban, and Laban tracks him down and says, "You've stolen my household idols," if you remember that story. And Jacob says, "What is my pesha? What is my trespass against you? How have I betrayed this relationship? I haven't done such a thing." It's a word that's used to talk about nations that have treaties with one another, but then betray one another. It's a word that's used to talk of not someone coming, say you were living in a home and some stranger came in and stole from you. But it's talking about your neighbor if they were to come over and steal from you. That would be pesha. It's someone that you're supposed to be able to trust, to count on, and who breaks that. Joseph's brothers, in fact, in Genesis 50, admitted that this was their sin. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, and this is at the end of Genesis after Jacob has died, they said to one another, "If Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him." And so they sent this message to Joseph. "Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, 'Please forgive your brother's transgressions.'" That word there, transgression, that's the word that's being used to talk about this breaking of trust between someone you ought to be able to count on. It's not a sin of someone in passing who just happens to go by you and say something unsavory to you and then move on. This is someone you know that you should be able to count on. Leviticus 16:21. This was even what was described, though, of our relationship to God. When God is giving instructions for the Day of Atonement, the day that God's going to forgive the sins of his people, he says to Aaron, or to them, Aaron will lay his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all of Israelites' iniquities, and it's translated here, rebellious acts, but it's that same word. That they were someone who were my people, and they chose to betray me, to rebel against me. This is not I'm starting here because there's all kinds of offense that we will encounter in this word. All types of ways that people will treat us poorly or do things wrong. I mean, any number of us could have come from our jobs today or a phone call today or something today where somebody has done something to offend us. And how do we respond to this? Why does it matter how we respond to this? And I think the answer is because how we respond to this really says a lot about how we think our relationship with God is and what sustains our relationship with God. How we respond to petty offenses, small things. How we respond to when someone deeply betrays our trust. These types of things reveal a lot to us about what we think of God's love towards us and God's patience towards us. In fact, with Israel being set up as this nation that has betrayed their God in this very intimate way, very grievous way, we read in Exodus 34, the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, and then here's that word translated rebellion, but pasha, forgiving the deep betrayal of someone who he knows and cares for, and sin. Proverbs 18:13 talks about how God's people were able to come to him to openly confess these things, that he was not a God whose heart, because they offended him, he was not the type of God who would forever turn away from them, but instead, Proverbs 28:13 says, the one who conceals his sins, and that word is pasha, the one who conceals his betrayal of God will not prosper. But whoever confesses and renounces them will find mercy. To be offended is something that's going to happen. The Bible doesn't pretend like we're not human in that respect. The Bible doesn't treat you and me like we're supposed to be these stoic people who have no response to the world or the influences around us or to what people do or don't do to us. The Bible knows that you and I are going to encounter times that people treat us poorly. The Bible also gives us instructions. One, through the character of God himself and how he demonstrated his response to those things. And two, through the ways that it actually gives us commands for how to respond to people in those situations. It gives us instructions for how to handle offense. The question is not, will you become offended? It's how will you respond when you are offended? Proverbs 18:19 talks about an offended brother is harder to reach than a fortified city, and quarrels are like the bars of a fortress. We all know this. We know that if you and I disagree about something, the person who lobs the first really personal insult loses, regardless of whether they have the right position or not. And why is that? Because of what it means to be offended. Being offended is this feeling or expressing hurt, indignation, or irritation because of a perceived wrong or insult. It makes you the victim instantly when you are offended. The other person has wronged you. And so you have this like moral ground to stand on to say, how dare you do what you've done? And we've all seen how that's used many times to do just like what Proverbs 18 talks about. Build up a wall to wrap yourself in a fortress against this other person. We all have been the person that offended someone else who spoke harshly to someone, who criticized them in an unfair way, and saw the walls go up. And you know that feeling where you realize you've just offended them, and you realize that you really can't say anything to them from that point on? This is one of the sad realities of being in ministry, is how easy this happens in churches sometimes. How someone gets offended and there's no room for ever reaching out to that person. They have no interest in hearing anything. They just push away. They withdraw. And it doesn't matter if you try to reach out or you try to say something. They have the moral high ground for being offended. And so, if anybody asks them, why did you leave the church? Well, because they offended me. And most people, because many people have been hurt by churches, will say, oh, I understand. So how do we respond to this? We're going to be offended. It's going to happen. I don't think we should be naive to the point of thinking that we will be able to do anything that will just eliminate people being offended in any way around us. People are going to get offended. Some of you will get offended with me at some point if you already haven't. And some of you will offend me at some point if you already haven't. And so, how do we respond? What do we do before this becomes personal? Before this gets into the heat of the moment where we build those walls and the ability for us to reconcile with one another, to be like Christ to one another is gone. How do we prepare, get ready for that? To be able to have disagreements and not be offended. To be able to genuinely be hurt by someone you trust. Pesha. How do we respond to that? Because we can think about petty things that we should just let go, and we can read Proverbs 18, 19, 11, where it says, a person's insight gives him patience, and his virtue is to overlook an offense. We can read that, and you think about a person cut me off going into a gas pump. Okay, overlook an offense. Though that seems to be a big ask sometimes. We can think about, okay, this person spoke in a harsh tone to me. Well, they were outside working, they were really sweaty, they were really hot, so I'm going to overlook this offense. We can think about that. But just to take this to kind of the highest level, to recognize the level of calling that God is putting on us as His followers and how we handle offense. Think about the person who's hurt you the most in your life. Think about the person that when you think of them, your heart instantly hurts because of what they've done. See, that's the level, if not more so, of the type of betrayal that the Bible uses when it's talking about the way that we have treated our God. We have betrayed Him. He gives us breath, and we curse Him with it. He gives us life, and we don't use it in order to give life to other people or other things. In many ways, we become instruments of death around us. He gives selflessly His love to us, and we give selfishly. We take the good that comes from our Father, and we give evil to those around us. Not all the time. Even in the most lost sinner that there is in this world, there's still semblances of God's grace in them where they do things that are still reflecting their Creator. But I've had more than one conversation. I've had many conversations with people that allude, though oftentimes they won't tell me exactly what it is, but allude to some big thing that they never thought they would do. Something in their past. I can think of 10 conversations in different places where I've sat with people as we've had those types of discussions. I've heard from people who say things like, I never thought I would be the person to do blank. And we think of these things, and we think of how ultimately these were offenses against God. Us betraying God and his love for us. And so we have this, we receive that. That's different to think about overlooking. That's much harder to put Psalm 19:11 into practice on. Because it hurts. So how do we go through that? Most of us, we think about that and we think, how in the world could I possibly overlook what's been done to me in these situations? And by overlook, there's a way to walk wisely through that process. There's all kinds of questions about, how can I overlook this when they broke my trust in this area? How do I respond? What limitations are on that? And I hear all that, but what I want us to see is that the grievousness of the sin, the grievousness of the betrayal still falls up under Psalm 19:11 because it uses that word, pesha. It's the most deep betrayal that a person of virtue is still able to overlook because they're reflecting the type of forgiveness that they themselves have received. So, as we go through this series about being unoffended, the reality is some of us may get offended because it's going to take our high horse out from up under us. You see, when you're offended, there's several ways you can respond, but two of the kind of large ways. The first, when you're offended and you can tell people why this person offended you, usually you're able to win people who come around you and console you. You're able to punish that person in a way because their reputation is tarnished. You're able to separate people out. And people look at you and say, yeah, you're right. I can't believe they did that. It gives you a certain power and control over them once you're offended. When your heart calluses towards them because you've caught them. They're in that offense, and others will know it and recognize it. But that's not how God treats us. I don't know about you, but God has not taken my offenses against him and published them for all to see. God did not take my offenses against him and use it to wield it over me and shame me and guilt me. God didn't take my offenses and use them to beat me down. Instead, he took my offenses and saw that I was more than my offenses. And he chose to love me. He chose to do the hard, dirty, difficult work that it was to save me. He chose to look past my offenses and give me mercy and grace and gifts that I didn't deserve. And it was precisely because everything and everyone around him screamed that we deserved what we were going to get. And yet he chose to love us. It's precisely why when I see that kind of love for me, it's like that moment in that clip that we saw. He had been loved and shown forgiveness by someone else. And so despite how much it angered him what Nate, the man he was talking to, had done, he was motivated to move past the offense, to see the person who an act of forgiveness, an act of love, an act of mercy could potentially change if he offered it. Romans 5, verse 15. Talking about what Adam did with his trespass and what Jesus did with his gift. Paul writes, "But the gift is not like the trespass. For if by one man's trespass, that's Adam's, his offense, his betrayal of this relationship with God, the many died, how much more have the grace of God and the gift which comes through the grace of the one man, Jesus, overflowed to many? And the gift is not like the one man's sin, because from one sin came the judgment, resulting in condemnation. But from many trespasses came the gift. Don't move past that phrase. But from many trespasses came the gift. When you see betrayal after betrayal after betrayal after betrayal after betrayal after betrayal, you do not expect some healing thing to come out of that. Yet it's what Christ did, resulting in justification. If by the one man's trespass death reigned through the one man, how much more will those who receive overflow of grace and the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? So then, as though one trespass, there is condemnation for everyone, so also through one righteous act there is justification leading to life for everyone. For just as through one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so also through the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Notice he keeps going back and forth. The trespass brought death, destruction, despair. The man acting through a gift of grace brought life and abundance and healing. The law came to multiply these trespasses, but where sin multiplied, isn't this astonishing? Grace multiplied even more. Now that's hard. That's hard to receive because it's expected of us. You see, our world, people who had nothing to do with Christ, watched that show Ted Lasso and recognized it got something right. They watched this show made by people who were not Christians, and they understood the beauty of offering forgiveness to those who were undeserving. Something that is the core of our very message. I just want to raise this question. Why is it that the world doesn't look at us and recognize that? Why is it that the world does not look at the church and say, that's the place where those who are undeserving find mercy? And it could be because we're not giving it to those who are undeserving. It could be because when we think about offense, we put a limit on how much offense we will tolerate until we write a person off. We say we'll go this far, but no further. And I hope as we spend time going through this session and this series of lessons, that what we will start to realize is the deep call that Christ has placed on us to offer freely what was given freely to us. And it's costly. There is no such thing as a disciple of Jesus that follows him without cost. It is costly to follow Jesus because you have to deny yourself and take up your cross to follow him. It's a daily waking up and giving up your rights to be things like offended. Because when you're offended, you reduce that other person to that offense. And that's all that they are. Because they did this one thing, they're no longer welcome in your life. They're no longer welcome to have an opinion. They're no longer even welcome to seek reconciliation. You become that fortress city, just like Proverbs talks about. But Jesus didn't do that to us. The type of grace that we're called to show says, I'm going to look through the offense and see the person and know that Christ made them for more. And so my goal is to do what Christ did with me, to see beyond the offenses and to help them draw closer to God in the process. Let's take a few minutes and pray.